The said these people were dead, 17 names, 17 graves, all a lie. 'Cause beneath the Millerville Opera House, they were still breathing, chained in the dark, while the men who put them there sat in church pews and shook hands in daylight. Listen carefully, because once you hear this, you will never see America's history the same way again. In the autumn of 1891, in a small industrial town in Pennsylvania, something was uncovered that was so vile, so corrosive to the illusion of safety, that the official records were sealed for over 30 years. That wasn't for your protection. It was for theirs. Theirs. Meaning the men who profited from it. Theirs. Meaning the institutions that signed off on it. Theirs. Meaning the officials who looked you in the eye, shook your hand, and swore they were protecting your family while selling human beings into a private nightmare. 17 people were found chained in the basement of the abandoned Millerville Opera House. Their bodies bore the signatures of prolonged captivity, starvation, scars, chemical burns. But here's the detail that was supposed to stay buried. Every single one of them had already been declared dead. Their death certificates filed months, even years earlier, across 3 different counties. Which means someone in authority didn't just know, they helped. The man at the center of this web was Cornelius Vanier, a towering, immaculate figure who looked more banker than criminal. For over a decade, operated what the public believed to be a traveling circus, Vanier's Cabinet of Wonders. Families brought their children to gape at the contortionist they called the Bone Serpent Woman, to marvel at the Bavarian Colossus, a man so large he could bend iron bars, to be entranced by the Singing Angel, a young woman with no arms, but a voice that seemed to come from heaven itself. What the crowds didn't know, what the newspapers were forbidden to print, was that many of these performers were not performers at all. They were captives. They had been taken, drugged, stripped of identity, told their families believed them dead, and remade into living curiosities. Their suffering was entertainment. Their chains were hidden behind velvet curtains, and the town let it happen. Because the money flowed. Because questions were dangerous. Because the sheriff's monthly bribe was worth more than any missing immigrant or orphan. This is not just a story about a freak show in 1891. This is a map showing exactly how corruption works, how power hides its filth in plain sight, and how easily an entire community can be trained not to see what's right in front of them. Millerville, 1891. 8,000 souls caught between the last breath of the countryside and the choking grip of industry. Coal dust in the air, the railroads' whistles splitting the night, steel foundries glowing like furnaces of some underworld god. Immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and Eastern Europe poured in for work, their accents foreign, their papers barely checked, their absence unnoticed if they vanished. This was the soil where men like Cornelius Vanier thrived, where a stranger with money could plant roots and no one would dig too deep to see what was rotting underneath. Vanier arrived dressed like an aristocrat, claiming a wealthy Dutch lineage from New York. No one could verify it. No one cared. His gold was real, his tips generous, his whiskey expensive, and in Millerville, that bought silence. In 1887, he purchased the old opera house, claiming it as winter quarters for his traveling show. The Cabinet of Wonders, they called it. A carnival of the strange. A legitimate enterprise, or so it seemed. But beneath the sawdust and the music, beneath the colored tents, something else festered. The freak show acts were too perfect, too unnatural. The Bone Serpent Woman bent her body into shapes that defied anatomy. The Bavarian Colossus, 8 feet of raw muscle, could twist steel with his bare hands. And the Singing Angel's voice seemed a miracle, her armless sleeves always draped just so, concealing truths no one dared imagine. They were marketed as oddities born of nature, but nature had nothing to do with it. They had been chosen, selected like livestock from towns just like Millerville. Orphans, the disabled, the unwanted. People whose disappearance wouldn't trigger outrage, just whispers. Vanier didn't work alone. Sheriff Josiah Cromwell, a man whose badge had long since become a license for vice, received $50 every month, more than most men earned in two, to ensure reports of missing persons died in his desk drawer. The town's doctor, Hinrich Kellerman, posed as a physician specializing in rare disorders. His credentials were lies, but his skill with chemicals was unmatched. Laudanum, opiates, and other concoctions kept bodies pliable and minds clouded, erasing resistance. Once taken, a captive would wake chained in the Opera House basement, identity shredded, reality rewritten. This was not just imprisonment, it was a process. System of breaking and rebuilding until the victim no longer remembered freedom, until the stage became the only world they believed existed. And because the town saw only ticket sales and spectacle, because fear and greed are perfect blindfolds, this system endured for years without a single outsider pulling back the curtain, until one mistake shattered the silence. It began with a knock in the middle of the night. Sharp, desperate, almost frantic. Thomas Fairchild, editor of the Millerville Weekly Gazette, working late in his dim office when the sound came. He opened the door to find a young woman, barefoot, clothes torn, eyes wide with the kind of terror that makes a person's voice come out in fragments. She was gaunt, her skin pale with malnutrition, but her grip on his arm was iron. "They're still down there," she whispered, breath shaking. "In the dark. The chains are too heavy." Her name, she thought, was Sarah Henley. But she wasn't sure anymore. She said she was from Lancaster, but she'd been shown papers declaring her dead. They told her she was gone, erased. She spoke of a place beneath the Opera House. Small, windowless rooms, a man with needles, a bitter medicine that blurred thought and time, and the endless, agonizing repetition of movements until her body screamed in pain. At first, Fairchild wondered if she was delirious. Hysteria was common, and her story was so extreme it strained belief. But the more she spoke, the less room there was for doubt. She described the basement's layout with architectural precision, details only someone who had been there could know. She named other captives: Jon Brinner, the Bavarian Colossus, a dock worker from Philadelphia who'd vanished; Catherine Alley, the singing angel from Scranton, lured by the promise of a legitimate audition 3 years before. Each name, each description, each scar she described matched people Fairchild had seen on stage. She told him of a ledger in Vanier's office listing every captive. Real name, where they'd come from, how much they'd cost, and the fake identity they'd been assigned. Some entries stretched back years. All were labeled as investments. Sarah's escape had been a crack in the machine. Kellerman's assistant, a nervous young man named Peter, had miscalculated her laudanum dose. Instead of falling into stupor, she'd woken with clarity, her restraints poorly secured. She ran, and now she sat in Fairchild's office, shaking but unbroken, offering him a truth that could ruin him if he pursued it, or redefine him if he survived it. That night, as the coal furnaces glowed across town and the Opera House sat silent, Fairchild made his choice. He would see what lay beneath. Didn't yet understand that he was stepping into a world where every rule he believed about justice, law, and human nature would be stripped away, one chain at a time. For 3 days, Fairchild moved like a shadow through Millerville, chasing the shape of Sarah's words. He combed death records from the past 5 years, and a pattern began to take form. An ugly geometry of vanishing lives. Dozens of people with disabilities or physical differences, listed as dead from sudden illness or accident, buried quickly, witnesses few. The dates of these deaths lined up almost perfectly with the travel schedule of Vanier's Cabinet of Wonders. Each correlation was a nail driven deeper into the coffin of doubt. Then came the moment that locked his resolve. In a faded photograph from the Gazette's archives, taken 2 years earlier at the county fair, recognized the towering figure of Jon Brynner in the crowd, months after his official death certificate had been filed in Philadelphia. Sarah's story was no delusion. It was a ledger written in stolen lives. Fairchild knew he couldn't rely on local law. Sheriff Cromwell wasn't just compromised. He was part of the architecture of the crime. But Fairchild underestimated the sheriff's paranoia. On the morning of October 16th, he walked into Cromwell's cramped office in the town hall basement to confront him, armed with nothing but questions. Cromwell sat cleaning his revolver, the metallic clicks punctuating the stale air. Without looking up, he said, "I hear you've been asking some interesting questions, Tom." Fairchild pressed him. About the deaths, the circus, the missing. The answer came not in words, but in steel. Cromwell rose and struck him across the face with the revolver's butt, sending him sprawling. Blood poured from his brow as Cromwell leveled the barrel at his head. "You're going to forget that girl. You're going to forget this conversation. And if you don't, well, accidents happen in mining towns. Men disappear all the time. It was a mistake." In that moment, Cromwell confirmed everything: his guilt, his alignment with Vanier, and the risk of continuing. Fairchild staggered out into the daylight with two truths burning in his skull. The story was real, and so was the danger. If he went further, it would cost him more than his career. It could cost him his life. But the image of Sarah's eyes, terrified, pleading, unbroken, burned hotter than fear, would not walk away. He would go into the basement. And when he did, he would not go to rescue. He would go to prove. Because proof, once seen by the right eyes, can burn down an empire. Fairchild understood the stakes now. No illusions, no safety nets. This was a game played in shadows, where one wrong move meant disappearing into the same ledger Sarah had described. So he planned with precision. Rescue was impossible. Too many captives, too few allies, and an opponent who owned the law in Millerville. Proof was the weapon he needed. Proof so undeniable it could bypass Cromwell's badge and Vanier's influence. Proof that would force eyes in Harrisburg, Philadelphia, even Washington to look. And for that, he would have to go under the Opera House. Sarah knew the layout. The maze of cells, the narrow hallways, the false wall hiding Vanier's office. She remembered the nightly patterns, when the hired guards took their supper upstairs, when Kellerman checked the captives, when Cromwell dropped in to collect his bribe. The only entry without a key was through a basement window she had left unlatched during her escape. Timing would be everything. The plan was set for the night of October 24th. Fairchild would bring a lantern with a shaded flame, photographic plates, chemicals, and the courage to descend into a darkness that smelled of rot and despair. They didn't know Vanier was already moving against them. Up in the Opera House, Kellerman's careful inventory of his supplies had uncovered a detail that set his nerves on fire. Several vials of chloroform missing, along with photographic chemicals. He knew exactly what that meant. Someone was preparing to document the operation. The discovery sent a chain reaction through the conspiracy. Kellerman summoned Vanier and Cromwell, and together they activated what they called the emergency protocol. It was simple. Eliminate all evidence. Eliminate all captives. Eliminate anyone asking questions. That night, the Opera House became a trap. The basement was quiet, just as Sarah had promised. The unlocked window welcomed them inside. But the air carried a sweet, heavy scent Fairchild couldn't place, clinging to the back of his throat. As they crept deeper, Lantern light revealed human forms chained to the walls. Starved bodies, drugged eyes, faces hollowed by years of captivity. Sarah whispered names, touching cold hands, promising they were leaving. Fairchild began setting up his camera, but in that same moment, the truth behind the odor hit him. Chloroform, pumped into the ventilation system. His limbs grew heavy, his thoughts slowed. From the stairwell above came the sound of boots and a low voice. Cornelius Vanier, descending with a revolver in one hand and a lantern in the other. Trap had closed. The chloroform thickened in the air, an invisible tide pulling them under. Sarah collapsed first, her body folding silently to the damp floor near the farthest cell. Fairchild fought to stay upright, to gather his camera and the precious ledger pages he'd found hidden behind Vanier's false panel. His fingers felt swollen, his lungs strained for air, and the shadows in the corners began to swirl. Through the haze, shapes emerged. Vanier's tall frame, lantern casting a sickly yellow hollow around his face, revolver steady in his gloved hand. Behind him came Sheriff Cromwell and Kellerman, and two other men whose eyes had the flat, empty calm of professional killers. "What have we here?" Vanier's voice was smooth, like a man greeting guests at a dinner table. "Curiosity," he said, stepping closer. "Is such a dangerous appetite." Fairchild's knees buckled. The ledger pages slipped from his grasp and vanished into Kellerman's waiting hands. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the flicker of satisfaction on Vanier's face, as if he'd just acquired a new exhibit. He woke shackled to a wall of cold stone, the iron cuffs biting into his wrists. His head throbbed, his mouth was dry, and somewhere nearby Sarah's faint breathing told him she was still alive. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time had no meaning in the blackness. Then the interrogations began. Cromwell went first, his questions delivered with the casual cruelty of a man used to breaking people. When Fairchild stayed silent, the sheriff's leather strap did the talking. Kellerman followed, all clinical precision, inflicting pain without leaving a mark. But it was Vanier who unsettled him most. Didn't threaten. He conversed, probing Fairchild's ambitions, his fears, his family, testing him, evaluating him. "You could be valuable," Vanier mused. "We could craft something special." Man of letters driven to madness by truths not meant to be known. The scholar of sorrows. Yes, the audience would love you. The words weren't just taunts. They were offers. In Vanier's world, a broken man wasn't discarded. He was remade, displayed, sold. Fairchild understood now this was never just a circus. It was a machine, identifying, acquiring, reshaping human beings into commodities. And if he didn't find a way out, his name would be scratched into that ledger under the same cold word Sarah had feared. Discontinued. Somewhere in the dark, his resolve hardened. He would not end here, but the only way to survive was to think like his captor. Cold, patient, and ready to strike when the moment came. Vanier's hospitality had a rhythm. Pain questions, silence, more pain. Between sessions, Fairchild was left chained in the damp cell. The walls sweating moisture, the air heavy with the stench of waste and chloroform residue. But the interrogations revealed something Vanier hadn't intended. Scope. This was bigger than Millerville. Through their taunts and careless boasts, Fairchild pieced together fragments, contacts in 6 states, corrupt doctors and sheriffs feeding him, recruits, and a secondary enterprise more depraved than the Cabinet of Wonders itself. Private exhibitions. These were not public shows for coins and gasps. They were invitation-only gatherings for wealthy patrons who paid for performances that blurred into violence and exploitation. The cabinet was the storefront. Private shows were the vault where the real money lay. And now, with his operation exposed, Vanier was preparing to vanish. The emergency protocol was already in motion. Kill the captives, destroy the records, burn the opera house to ash, and relocate to an asylum in Ohio where a corrupt director had agreed to shelter his work. The plan was precise, except for one variable Vanair hadn't accounted for. Fairchild wasn't alone. 2 days before Sarah's escape, Fairchild had written to Margaret Dalton, an old colleague at the Philadelphia Inquirer, hinting at his suspicions and naming the Cabinet of Wonders outright. He told her, if she heard nothing from him within 10 days, to alert the highest authorities she could reach. That deadline was closing fast. Dalton was not the type to wait politely. She had friends in the Treasury Department, contacts in the newborn Bureau of Investigation, and a talent for making the right people very uncomfortable. More than that, she had insurance. She had already duplicated Fairchild's letter and sent copies to journalists in Pittsburgh and New York. If she moved, the story would spread faster than Vanair could silence it. On October 28th, a telegram arrived in Millerville addressed to Cromwell, seemingly routine. In reality, it was a message to Fairchild. Arriving November 1st with documentation team, federal authorities interested. Arrange meetings. The words were simple, but the meaning was clear. Help was coming. The wrong kind of help for Vanair. Panic cracked his careful composure. He abandoned any thought of relocation and decided on the fastest, most brutal path. Kill everyone in the basement tonight. Torch the building, disappear with whatever gold and ledgers he could carry. Thought it would erase the trail. In truth, it would light it up for the world to see. The night of October 29th settled over Millerville like a shroud. Inside the opera house, the machinery of murder began to turn. Kellerman worked methodically at a table in the makeshift laboratory, measuring morphine and strychnine into precise doses. 17 vials. One for each captive. The plan was to tell them it was a sedative, to still their struggles before the fire consumed their bodies and the building around them. Upstairs, Vanair moved through his office, gathering gold coins, select documents, and a revolver he polished with ritual care. Cromwell paced the hall, revolver at his hip, the sheriff's badge on his chest, now nothing more than an ornament for a hired killer. But in the midst of their precision, a fault line cracked. Peter, the same nervous assistant whose mistake had allowed Sarah to escape, looked at the vials on Kellerman's table and decided he could not be part of what came next. The images of the chained captives, the stench of the basement, the hollow eyes of Yon and Catherine had been gnawing at him for months. Tonight, the gnawing became unbearable. Without warning, he slipped out a side door into the cold air and ran for the home of Reverend Samuel Brooks, one of the few men in town untouched by Vanair's reach. At first, Brooks thought Peter was drunk or mad, but as Peter spoke, detailing the captives, their injuries, the ledger, the basement layout, the Reverend's skepticism cracked. He realized if Peter was lying, it was the kind of lie that demanded investigation. Together, they crafted a desperate two-part plan. Brooks would send urgent telegrams to the Pennsylvania State Police and the governor's office, while Peter would return to the opera house to stall Kellerman's poison long enough for help to arrive. It was a gamble measured in hours, maybe minutes. Back in his cell, Fairchild felt the shift in the air. He had been working for days on a single point of weakness. The anchor bolt securing his chain to the damp stone wall. Moisture and age had eaten at the mortar. Every moment without eyes on him, leaned his weight against it, listening for the groan of surrender in the stone. Tonight, as the sounds of movement and muffled voices grew above him, the bolt gave way. Freedom was close, but not clean. Guards still patrolled the basement. His body was weak, battered, but now there was an opening. One that would either lead him out of the darkness or straight into the heart of Vanair's kill plan. Fairchild slid free of the wall, cuffs still locked to his wrist, but the chain now useless. The cold stone floor pressed against his bare feet as he moved in silence, hugging the damp walls, every step calculated. He knew the basement now. The choke points, the blind corners, the short hall that curved toward the laboratory where Kellerman worked. He did not know if Sarah was awake. He did not know if anyone else had the strength to stand. But he knew this: he could not wait for the law to arrive and sort them out. By the time badges came through the door, there would only be corpses to rescue. He reached Sarah's cell first. Her eyes opened at his whisper. She was pale, trembling, but when he told her the bolt was out, she pulled herself upright. Between the two of them, they freed 3 others. 2 half-conscious, 1 barely breathing. Before the truth of their situation became a fist in the chest. Most of the captives were too far gone. Drugged into fog, muscles wasted, minds cracked from years of captivity, they recoiled from the idea of escape. Some simply shook their heads, murmuring that the stage was home. Now, that was Kellerman's final cruelty. Not just to imprison, but to make freedom terrifying. Sarah moved from cell to cell, speaking each name, her voice steady, coaxing, reminding them of lives they'd been told were gone. Slowly, some began to stir, to remember. But above them, the opera house was alive with motion. Shouts, furniture scraping, heavy boots. The emergency protocol was moving forward. Then came the moment that could have destroyed everything. Kellerman, growing suspicious of Peter's delays, descended into the basement with a lantern. His eyes swept the corridor. They locked on Fairchild's empty cell. His face twisted, not in surprise, but in confirmation of a fear he'd already formed. "They're loose." The words cut the dark like a blade. Footsteps thundered above as Cromwell and 2 hired men rushed down the stairs, revolvers in hand. Vanier followed, his face carved from ice, his focus narrowing instantly to Fairchild. The narrow stone corridor became a killing ground. The captives caught between the men who'd kept them chained and the 2 people trying to lead them out. In that moment, survival hinged on one truth Fairchild understood better than anyone else in that basement. Vanier didn't want the captives. He wanted him. That fixation would be the only gap wide enough to push through. Vanier's eyes never left Fairchild, even as chaos erupted around them. Guards shouted, captives stumbled toward the stairs, Sarah pulling at their arms, urging them upward. Cromwell moved to block the escape, revolver raised. But the thunder of a voice from above froze him in place. "Sheriff." It was Reverend Brooks, framed in the stairwell light, flanked by 3 men in state police uniforms. Their presence was a crack in the fortress, unexpected and perfectly timed. They were the advance team, having reached Millerville hours earlier than Brooks or Peter had dared hope, catching the conspirators mid-act. Cromwell hesitated, torn between bluffing authority and retreating into violence. Hesitation was fatal to his control of the moment. 2 of the police pushed past Brooks and began pulling captives up the stairs, their lantern light bouncing across hollow faces and shackled limbs. Vanier didn't move toward the stairs. He stepped forward, revolver low, his voice calm enough to chill the blood. "You think you've won, Mr. Fairchild. This is just one chapter in a book you can't close." Fairchild didn't answer. He sidestepped toward Sarah, putting himself between her and the revolver, while his eyes tracked the narrowest space between Vanier and the wall. A gap wide enough to slip a body through if the man's focus broke for a second. The break came from above. Peter, positioned at the top of the stairs, shouted something down in a panic. "Fire in the north wing." It wasn't true, but it was enough. Vanier turned his head just slightly, his eyes flicking toward Cromwell. Fairchild moved. In a surge of desperation, he shoved past, slamming his shoulder into Vanier's ribs, knocking the revolver's aim skyward. The shot cracked into the stone ceiling, dust raining down. Sarah pulled at his sleeve, dragging him toward the stairs as Cromwell barked orders that were already drowned out by the confusion. They climbed, dragging two of the weaker captives with them, bursting into the main hall where overturned chairs and scattered props told the story of a hasty dismantling. But the danger wasn't past. Vanier's voice rose from below, cold and certain. "You will not leave here alive." His footsteps followed, steady and unhurried, like a predator closing on prey that has nowhere left to run. Outside, the cold air waited. Between them and that air lay one last choke point. The front doors, and whatever Vanier had stationed there to ensure his final act of erasure. The main hall stretched before them, dim gaslight throwing long shadows over the chaos. Costumes lay trampled on the floor. Half-disassembled stage sets leaned against the walls like broken teeth. The front doors loomed at the far end, but between them and freedom stood two of Vanier's hired men. Thick-necked, armed, their posture coiled for violence. One of them smiled at the sight of Fairchild and Sarah, as though the hunt had been too brief for his liking. Behind, the echo of Vanier's boots on the stairs grew louder, deliberate. He wasn't rushing. He didn't have to. Believed the building itself was his cage, and they were already caught. Sarah whispered, "We can't fight them," her voice raw with exhaustion. Fairchild's mind spun, searching for something other than brute force. The captives they had brought up stood trembling, too weak to run, their eyes darting between the exit and the shadows behind them. Then a new sound cut through the tension. The creak of massive wood straining, followed by a splintering crack. From the far side of the hall, a door to the storage rooms burst open, and in its frame stood Jon Brinner, the Bavarian colossus. His frame was gaunt, but even starved muscle holds power, and in that moment, some long, buried instinct had roared back to life. His gaze locked on Kellerman, who had just emerged from the stairwell. The doctor's composure shattered. He turned to retreat, but Jon was already moving, each step a thundering declaration that the years of obedience were over. The barricade Vanier and Kellerman had constructed upstairs meant nothing to him. With a sweep of his massive arms, he hurled aside furniture as though clearing brush. State police surged through the breach behind him, weapons drawn, the room instantly shifting from predator's den to contested ground. One of Vanier's hired men fired at the advancing officers, and the report of the gun seemed to shake the captives awake. Sarah seized the moment, pulling the weakest toward the doors as the officers engaged the gunmen. Fairchild moved with them, feeling the air grow colder with each step toward the night. But in the corner of his vision caught sight of Vanier, calm in the chaos, feeding documents into a small fire in a metal bin. Even now, he was erasing himself, confident that without his ledger, the truth would dissolve into rumor. Fairchild knew he had only seconds to decide to step into safety or turn toward the man who had built this empire of chains and try to steal the last weapon that could destroy him. Fairchild turned. The cold night was a breath away, but he stepped back into the heat of the room, into the sphere of Vanier's fire. The man didn't flinch at his approach. His eyes glimmered with something between contempt and curiosity. "You still don't understand," Vanier said, feeding another ledger page into the flame. "This is not about me. Cut off one head, and another will grow. The cabinet was only one face of the market. There are others. Men far richer, far more patient." The paper curled black in the bin, ashes lifting on the updraft. Fairchild's gaze darted to the desk. Papers scattered, some in German, others scrawled with names, dates, amounts. Enough to wound him, maybe enough to bleed the network. But the fire was hungry. Each second meant another record gone. Fairchild lunged, his shackled wrist smashing the edge of the desk, scattering the remaining sheets. Vanier moved with sudden violence, the revolver flashing from his coat. The first shot tore splinters from the desk, grazing Fairchild's arm. The second would have ended him if Jon hadn't intervened. The giant's shadow fell over them both, and with a force born of years of humiliation, he drove Vanir backward, the revolver clattering to the floor. Officers surged into the office, tackling Vanir as he fought with a manic strength. Kellerman was dragged in moments later, pale and trembling, his defiance gone. Fairchild dropped to one knee, gathering what documents he could, pressing them into the hands of a state police sergeant. "These," he said through ragged breaths, "go to Harrisburg. Don't let them vanish." In the hall outside, the surviving captives were being herded into the open air, their chains clinking like a funeral dirge. Sarah stood among them, her eyes fixed on Fairchild until he emerged. The opera house now roared with shouts and the clatter of boots. The true sound was the crackle of the fire Vanir had started. Small for now, but eager to grow. As the officers secured the prisoners, Fairchild looked once at the man in irons. Vanir's lips curled in a smile that didn't belong to someone defeated. "You've won nothing," he murmured, just loud enough for Fairchild to hear. And for the first time that night, Fairchild wondered if Vanir might be right. Because if the network was as deep as he claimed, the opera house was only the skin of the thing, and the body still lived somewhere in the dark. Outside, the night air hit like a shock, cutting through the heat and stench of the opera house. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness as townsfolk gathered at a cautious distance, murmuring in confusion. Some recognized the faces of the captives, people they had been told were long dead. The recognition wasn't relief. It was horror. To admit these people were alive meant admitting the lies they had swallowed for years. State police moved quickly, forming a perimeter, separating the wounded from the gawkers. A medic knelt beside Catherine Eiley, the singing angel, her voice now a rasp barely audible over the cold wind. When she tried to speak, the medic told her to save her strength, but she shook her head and forced out the first line of a hymn. It was weak, fragile, and then others joined. One by one, the captives began to sing, cracked voices, missing notes. But together, they filled the street with something the years of abuse had not erased. It was the first sound of ownership they'd taken back. Inside, the opera house still burned in small pockets, the fire contained but smoldering. Officers carried out Kellerman's instruments. Glass vials, restraints, surgical tools stained with rust and worse. Each item went into evidence crates, tagged and sealed, though Fairchild knew some things could never be sealed away. Cromwell sat cuffed on the steps, his face slack, eyes darting from the crowd to the manacles on his wrists as though trying to wake from a nightmare. Vanir, by contrast, moved like a man boarding a private coach. Shoulders straight, chin high, his cuffs almost ornamental. He caught Fairchild's eye in the torchlight and smiled again, a silent reminder that prisons could be escaped, records destroyed, witnesses silenced. Fairchild turned away, but the weight of that look stayed on him. He found Sarah at the edge of the street, wrapped in a blanket, speaking to a state officer. She was giving names. Each one a story, each one a challenge to the lies that had hidden this operation for years. Fairchild realized her memory was the most dangerous weapon they had now. Paper could burn. Officials could be bought, but a survivor's voice, once it reached the right ears, could unravel a machine. He stepped beside her, not as a rescuer, but as a witness. And as the hymn faded into the night, he knew the real battle was just beginning. Because exposing the Cabinet of Wonders would be the first blow in a war against something far larger and far older than Millerville. By morning, Millerville was no longer just a mining town. It was a crime scene, a headline, and a wound that would not close quietly. The Pennsylvania generals representative arrived with more state police, presence shifting the air from local scandal to a matter of statewide consequence. Reporters began to appear, first from nearby counties, then from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, drawn by whispers of human trafficking, murder, and official corruption. The first photographs of the captives were taken in the pale dawn light. Wrapped in blankets, faces gaunt but unbroken, they stood in a line that told more truth than any testimony could. Fairchild stayed close, ensuring names were matched to faces, that the ledger fragments he'd saved were corroborated by living proof. Vanair was loaded into a wagon under heavy guard, yet his composure was infuriating. Shackled, he still managed to address the reporters like a man giving a lecture. "You misunderstand," he told them. "I provided these people a purpose. Without me, they were forgotten, unwanted. I gave them a stage." His voice carried across the street, planting seeds of doubt in the ears of those who didn't want to believe their sheriff, their doctor, their respected showman had run a marketplace of flesh. Kellerman, in contrast, looked like a ghost. His hands shook constantly, his eyes darting as though calculating how much of the truth might spare him the rope. Cromwell sat apart, silent, the sheriff's badge gone from his chest. It was Reverend Brooks who broke the paralysis of the townspeople. Standing on the Opera House steps, suit still on his coat from the night before, he called out each captive's real name, each hometown, each false death certificate. He didn't soften it. He forced the crowd to see the cost of their silence. Some wept, others turned away, but a few stepped forward, neighbors, cousins, distant kin, to claim the living they had been told to mourn. Fairchild watched it all, knowing the investigation would spread beyond Millerville's borders. Vanner's own words had hinted at a network. Cabinet of Wonders was just one feeder into a larger machine. That machine still existed. And as he looked at Sarah, speaking with a reporter who scribbled furiously, he understood something dangerous. The story was already bigger than he could control. Once unleashed, truth takes on a life of its own. And if Vanair's shadow stretched as far as Fairchild suspected, there were men in other towns already deciding how to protect their share of the darkness. The trials began the following spring, and Millerville became a stage of its own. A place where law and spectacle collided. Courtrooms overflowed. Strangers filled the gallery, some out of outrage, others out of morbid curiosity, the same appetite that had once drawn them to Vanair's tent. The charges stacked Heidi. 3 counts of kidnapping, 17 counts of unlawful imprisonment, 26 counts of murder. And beneath those numbers lay the quieter charges: fraud, bribery, falsifying death certificates, that showed how deep the rot had run. Vanair's defense was audacity. He leaned into the arrogance that had shielded him for years, claiming he had been misunderstood, that his performers had consented, that the money exchanged had been care, for those society had abandoned. His attorney argued that the false death certificates were acts of mercy, freeing the captives from families that had cast them aside. It was calculated poison, enough to make the unthinking wonder if there was a grain of truth in the lie. But then the survivors took the stand. Sarah Henley told of the night she was taken, of the bitter taste of laudanum and the awakening in chains. Jon Brinner's testimony came halting, fragmented by the damage done to his mind, but the size of him in the witness box was enough to make every juror see the scale of the man who had been reduced to an obedient shadow. Catherine Alley spoke softly, her voice still scarred, but her description of singing under threat of punishment, her songs forced into private exhibitions, cut through the courtroom like glass. Kellerman, facing life in prison, turned on Vanair completely. In exchange for avoiding the gallows, he delivered detailed accounts of every acquisition, every method of control, and every official bribed. His testimony confirmed what Fairchild had suspected. Millerville was only one of several hubs feeding a network that reached across the eastern seaboard. Cromwell's cooperation was less noble. He offered names to save himself from the worst of his sentence, billing years' worth of corruption in minutes. Outside the courthouse, the press fed on every revelation, printing words that only months before would have been silenced. Fairchild wrote his own accounts, unflinching and precise, ensuring that no amount of legal maneuvering could sand the edges off the truth. Still, he knew the danger had not passed. Every name Kellerman or Cromwell gave was a living man with resources, connections, and a vested interest in burying the rest of the story. And as the verdict drew near, Fairchild began to feel the weight of Venaire's warning. You can cut off a head, but the body can live on. The verdict came down on a cold March morning in 1893. Courthouse was silent as the foreman read the words. Guilty on all major counts. For the kidnappings, for the unlawful imprisonment, for the murders. The sentence of death by hanging. No gasp, no outcry, just the quiet weight of inevitability settling over the room. Vanier stood like a man listening to a verdict he'd already heard in some private rehearsal. When the judge asked if he had any final statement, he smiled. Not the nervous twitch of a broken man, but the slow curve of someone who still believed himself in control. You think this ends with me, he said, voice steady enough to carry across the benches. But markets don't die. They relocate. The sheriff's deputies led him away, his posture that of a man leaving a meeting rather than facing the gallows. Kellerman received life in prison for his cooperation, his testimony having cut the legs out from under Vanier's defense. Cromwell took 20 years in exchange for exposing the network's reach, though Fairchild doubted the former sheriff would live long enough to serve half of it. Outside, the crowd that had gathered to hear the verdict broke into pockets. Some speaking of justice served, others muttering that the showman's words sounded more like a prophecy than a bluff. Fairchild wrote his account that night by lamplight, the scratch of the pen loud in the stillness. He described the trial, the survivors' testimonies, the damning evidence, but he also included what the official reports would not. The way Vanier had carried himself, the subtle threads of influence that still clung to him even as the noose drew near. On the morning of March 15, 1893, the prison yard filled with the gray light of early spring. Witnesses, officials, clergy, press, stood in stiff rows as Vanier was brought out. He wore black, his hair neatly combed, his gaze fixed straight ahead. When asked for last words, he paused long enough for silence to settle into discomfort. I built nothing you can destroy, he said. Then the trapdoor fell. Fairchild watched without satisfaction. The body hung still, but the words stayed alive, echoing in his mind. Because if Kellerman's ledgers were accurate, there were other cabinets in other towns already in motion. And men far beyond Millerville had just lost one of their most profitable partners. The question wasn't whether they'd rebuild. It was how soon. In the months after the execution, Millerville tried to return to the rhythm of a mining town, but the air carried a permanent aftertaste, like coal smoke that clings to skin no matter how hard you scrub. The Opera House was demolished within a year, its bricks sold off, its foundation left as an empty scar in the center of town. In 1934, a small memorial garden would be planted there, a plaque naming the 17 survivors in the 26 marked discontinued in Vanier's ledger. But in 1893, the space was nothing but rubble, a place people crossed quickly, eyes down. For the survivors, rebuilding was uneven. Sarah Hemley returned to Lancaster, reunited with family who had mourned her for years. She became an advocate, quiet but relentless, for others taken and hidden away in traveling shows. She wrote letters to lawmakers, testified when asked, and kept a personal list of cases that smelled like the cabinet's work. Jon Briner found shelter in a church community in Philadelphia. The damage done to his mind never fully healed, but he worked as a gardener and handyman, content in the simple routines that no one could take from him. Catherine, Allie's voice, never regained its full strength, but she married a merchant in Scranton who had believed her dead. She lived quietly, keeping in touch with some of the other survivors until her death in 1934. Fairchild's own path was less still. His reporting on the Millerville case opened doors to bigger papers in New York, where he worked as an investigative journalist for the rest of his career. But he carried the Opera House in his head, its corridors, its smell, its cells. He carried Vanier's last words too, and they shaped the kind of stories he chased. Margaret Dalton became the Philadelphia Inquirer's first female investigative correspondent, and the two collaborated for years. Together, they broke stories of other corrupt shows, asylums run like prisons, orphanages that sold their wards into employment that was anything but. They learned quickly that the Cabinet of Wonders had been one room in a far larger house. Some of the names Kellerman gave were arrested. Others vanished before warrants arrived. And sometimes, in a city hundreds of miles away, Fairchild would catch sight of a face in a crowd. A performer on a street corner, an oddity in a sideshow poster, and wonder if they were free by choice or if another ledger somewhere still called them an investment. The Millerville case became more than a headline. It became a precedent. In courtrooms and legislative halls, lawmakers cited it as proof that the United States needed tighter laws on traveling entertainments, better oversight of missing persons cases, and cooperation between jurisdictions that had long operated like isolated fiefdoms. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the machinery Vanier had thrived and could be dismantled piece by piece. But reforms move slowly, and men who profit from the shadows move faster. Fairchild saw it firsthand. While the Cabinet of Wonders was gone, the market it fed into was not. Newspapers in other states began running small, almost identical notices. A marvel, discovered in some rural county, and like extraordinary human curiosity, set to tour the region. To most readers, they were harmless oddities. To Fairchild, they read like calling cards. Some of the methods even echoed Vanier's. Falsified records, sudden disappearances, officials with selective memories. He and Dalton followed leads to half a dozen towns over the next 5 years, and in 3 of them, they found proof of similar operations. None as large as Millerville's, but all running on the same principles. Each time they exposed one, another seemed to sprout somewhere else. In private moments, Dalton compared it to cutting weeds. Roots are deep, Tom. You pull one, and 2 more break the surface. What haunted Fairchild most wasn't the persistence of the network, but the indifference that allowed it to thrive. The same towns that had profited from Vanier's circus had also looked away from its crimes, and now he saw that pattern repeated everywhere. People preferred their monsters to be obvious, something they could point to and condemn, while the real ones stood beside them in daylight, shaking hands, buying drinks, and smiling for photographs. Over time, the memory of Millerville faded from public consciousness, surviving only in yellowed clippings and the garden plaque. But for those who had descended into that basement, the memory was not something that faded. It was something that waited. Fairchild began to feel the weight of an unspoken truth. Millerville had not been an isolated atrocity. It had been a message. The question wasn't whether there were other cabinets still operating. The question was how many, and how far one man was willing to go to find them. Years later, Fairchild would admit, though only to Dalton, that the Millerville case had changed something fundamental in him. It wasn't just the brutality of what he'd seen in that basement, or the arrogance in Vanier's eyes as the rope was placed around his neck. It was the realization that the line between the stage and the cell was thin, and it could be crossed without anyone noticing if enough people decided not to look. That knowledge sat in his chest like a stone. Every investigation after Millerville felt like peeling back a familiar wallpaper, always expecting to find the same rot underneath. And too often he did. He began keeping his own ledger, not of victims, but of patterns. Dates when a new exhibition arrived in a town, sudden changes in local records, names of traveling doctors and lawmen who turned up again and again in different jurisdictions. Dalton called it your shadow map, and she was right. It was a map of absence, tracing the movements of something that didn't want to be seen. They chased rumors from Illinois to Georgia, and in the late autumn of 1901, they came close to breaking open a second network operating out of a defunct asylum in Maryland. But the night before the raid, the building burned to the ground, every potential witness consumed in the flames. The official report blamed faulty lanterns. Fairchild didn't believe it. Neither did Dalton. The shadow map grew, but so did the resistance. Editors grew cautious, reluctant to print stories that implicated men with deep pockets. Witnesses vanished between interviews. Anonymous letters arrived warning him to stop digging graves you don't want to fall into. Fairchild ignored them, but he learned to watch his back. And still, every so often, dreamed of the Opera House, its corridors lit by a single shaded lantern, the smell of chloroform thick in his lungs, Sarah's voice whispering in the dark. In those dreams, he never made it to the stairs. He would wake with the weight of chains around his wrists that weren't there. By the turn of the century, he knew the truth Dalton had hinted at years earlier. Millerville wasn't the end of a story, it was the prologue. Whatever market Vanier had served, it hadn't died with him. It had only changed shape, waiting for men like Vanier to step forward and build the next cabinet. And there would be another, there was always another. By the winter of his life, Fairchild had stopped pretending the war could be won. The network he'd glimpsed in the wake of Millerville was too fluid, too adaptable. It didn't wear one face, it wore 1,000. Sometimes it was a circus, sometimes a private asylum, sometimes an orphanage, with locked doors and barred windows. Each time one was exposed, the men behind it didn't vanish. They migrated, carrying their trade to new towns, new audiences, new willing collaborators in positions of authority. Fairchild and Dalton kept writing as long as editors would print them, but he understood the deeper truth. Exposure was not the same as destruction. You could drag a cabinet into the light, but you couldn't make the world keep looking. People turned away. They always turned away. In his final years, Fairchild kept Sarah Henley's photograph on his desk. It had been taken in Lancaster after she'd rebuilt her life enough to stand in front of a camera without fear in her eyes. She had written to him often, updating him on the families she'd helped reunite, the young women she'd convinced to walk away from offers that felt too much like bait. She always ended the same way: "We can't save everyone, Tom, but we can keep trying." That sentence stayed with him longer than Vanier's warning. He began passing his shadow map to younger journalists, ones hungry enough to step into the dark without knowing how deep it went. Told them what Dalton had once told him: you don't go looking for these places unless you're prepared to find them. And he meant it. In his last published piece, written in 1922, he described the Millerville Opera House without naming it, as if daring those with long memories to recognize it. The article ended not with a conclusion, but a question. How many ledgers are still out there? How many names already marked, discontinued, before we ever knew they were alive? Fairchild died the following spring, his papers boxed and sent to an archive that would take decades to open them. Dalton lived longer, long enough to see other cases surface that bore the same marks. The garden in Millerville still stands, its plaque weathered, its flowers tended by hands that may not know the full weight of the soil they touch. But beneath that quiet, the truth remains: the most dangerous monsters in history are not myths. They are men. And the systems that protect them are always ready to build another cabinet of wonders.